California Task Force to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans. Content warning. It contains discussions of racial discrimination, sexual assault, torture, lynching, and other forms of extreme violence. Contains unedited historical quotations and photographs of white supremacist hatred, torture, lynching, autopsy, and other forms of graphic violence.
Following is a non-exhaustive list of labor-related New Deal laws and programs and the ways in which they have discriminated against African Americans. Many of the New Deal laws created the foundational structures that continue to provide Americans with a social safety net today. Industrial Recovery Act of 1933. The National Industrial Recovery Act created the National Recovery Agency, established industry-specific minimum wages and employment protections. The National Recovery Agency eventually enacted over 540 codes providing for minimum wages and maximum hours in different industries. 224. Many employers advocated for explicitly racist codes before the agency. One argued that black workers made a much better workman and a much better citizen. So far as the South is concerned, when he is not paid the highest wage, 225, while explicit race-based codes were not adopted. Of geographic and occupational classifications in the codes often accomplished the same goal. An industry code would classify a state as either northern or southern for the purpose of setting a minimum wage, with southern states often having a lower minimum. 226 in different occupations. By different codes, had different minimum wages. One example demonstrates how the government used both geographic and occupational classifications and exclusions to pay black workers less and provide them fewer protections. Delaware was classified as being northern, and thus subject to a higher minimum wage, for 449 industry codes. Classified as being southern, and thus subject to a lower minimum wage, for the fertilizer industry, where black workers made up 90% of the industry. 227. John P. Davis, in a speech to the 25th Annual Conference of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in 1934 stated, One common denominator in all these variations is the presence or absence of Negro labor. Where most workers in a given industry are Negro, that section is called South and inflicted with low wage rates. Where Negroes are negligible, the procedure is reversed. 228. Of the occupational and geographic differentials in the wage codes was clear to those involved in implementing the National Industrial Recovery Act. At the time, the executive director of the National Recovery Agency's Labor Advisory Board wrote in 1934, the degree the Southern rate is a rate for Negroes, it is a relic of slavery and should be eliminated. 229. That same year, Ira Day Reid, of the National Urban League, wrote in the newspaper The Chicago Defender, Negro's initial attitude towards the National Recovery Act is best reflected in the interpretation of initials given by one observer who called it Negro Riddance Act. 230. Labor Relations Act of 1935. Act. National Labor Relations Act of 1935 NLRA or Wagner Act, proposed by Senator Robert Wagner, dramatically increased the power of organized labor by allowing officially certified unions in certain sectors the right to negotiate on behalf of all employees. Supported by a majority of workers. 231. The National Labor Relations Board NLRB, the agency designated to administer the law, was able to hold hearings and resolve disputes involving union representation. NLRA harmed African Americans by purposefully allowing unions to discriminate based on race and by failing to cover sectors of the economy that mostly employed African Americans. 232. This undermined the bargaining power of black workers and their ability to participate in the newly recovering economy for decades. 233. Unions have played a critical role in the development of American society and the day-to-day experience of the American worker during and after the New Deal. Workers' and employers' power was uniquely balanced, which enabled an unprecedented improvement in the condition of the working class in America. Benefits of which continue to be seen today. 234 For example, workers with strong unions have been able to set industry standards for wages and benefits that help all workers. Union and non-union 235 inches union workers are more likely to be covered by employer-provided health insurance. More than 9 in 10 workers covered by a union contract, 94%, have access to employer-sponsored health benefits, compared with just 68% of non-union workers. 236 is another example. Union workers also have greater access to paid sick days. 9 in 10 workers covered by a union contract, 91%, have access to paid sick days, compared with 73% of non-union workers. 237. Leaders proposed amendments to the NLRA to prohibit government certification of a union that did not allow black workers to join and have all rights. The American Federation of Labor, the principal white-dominated federation of craft unions, this protection due to its desire to eliminate competition from black workers. 238 The American Federation of Labor in Southern Democrats won, and the final law protected the bargaining rights of unions with racist membership policies. This gave white labor organizers the power to exclude black workers from contract negotiations and implement their racist views in the union contracts, protected by the federal government. 239. Final law also excluded agricultural and domestic workers, another compromise to the Southern Democrats. 240. The law essentially allowed unions to ignore and discriminate against black workers by protecting segregated unions. Unions refused to admit black workers or afford them the privileges of membership, segregated black workers into less skilled jobs. Collective bargaining rights to force employers to replace black workers with white workers, while the NLRB, the federal agency charged with administering the NLRA, stood out of the way. 241 For example, the NLRB certified building service employees union in New York forced Manhattan hotels, restaurants, and offices to replace black elevator operators and restaurant workers with white employees. Agency took no action in response. 242. In 1944, the U.S. Supreme Court held that unions were obligated to represent their members without discriminating on the basis of race, but did not require them to eliminate racial segregation in their membership or provide black union members with a mechanism for enforcing their civil rights. 243. In 1964 did the federal agency finally decide that it could revoke a union's government certificate due to its racial segregation. 244 Even then, individual black workers still had limited recourse against racist union leadership. Employees subject to a racist union could not deal directly with their employer instead. 245 Additionally, even after the NLRB stopped certifying whites-only unions, minority rules meant that black workers would need years to secure wages comparable to those of white workers. 246. Security Act of 1935. Security Act of 1935 created old age and unemployment benefits to help seniors and those out of work. This landmark law followed the same pattern as the rest of the New Deal legislation in limiting how its benefits applied to African Americans through occupational carve-outs for agricultural and labor, and allowing local rather than federal administration. 47 Although some historians dispute the allegation that Congress acted with racist intent in making these carve-outs. 248 The Social Security Act created several programs that remain central to the government's efforts to ensure some minimal level of financial stability, including retirement insurance. Unemployment insurance, and aid to families with dependent children programs 249. Law essentially allowed unions to ignore black workers by maintaining segregated unions, segregating black workers into less skilled jobs, locking them out of contract negotiations, and using collective bargaining rights to force employers to replace black workers with white workers. During the debate over the Social Security Act, Congress acknowledged the preponderance of black workers in the agricultural and domestic labor sectors, but excluded these occupations despite accusations of racism. 250 Charles H. Houston testified on behalf of the NAACP, in these states where your Negro population is heaviest. You'll find the majority of Negroes engaged either in farming or else in domestic service, so that, unless we have some provisions which will expressly extend the provisions of the bill to include domestic servants and agricultural workers, I submit that the bill is inadequate. 151. Americans advocated for a non-discrimination provision in the statute as protection from the racist local administration of previous relief statutes. For example, one activist pointed out that in the local administration of past emergency measures, there had been repeated, widespread, and continued discrimination on account of race or color, as a result of which Negro men, women, did not share equitably and fairly in the distribution of the benefits accruing from the expenditure of such federal funds. 252 Congress did not include any such provision in order to secure the support of Southern Democrats. H. Houston expressed the view of many African Americans: if we follow the history of the Workmen's Compensation Acts, we know that two great classes of workers who will be excluded from the benefit of unemployment insurance, they are agricultural workers and domestic workers. Again, 3 out of every 5 Negro workers dropped through the holes of the sieve. 253. Labor Standards Act of 1938. Labor Standards Act of 1938 FLSA, which is still in force today, provides the federal minimum, the maximum number of working hours before overtime pay is required, and the limits on child labor. Like other New Deal laws, in order to appease Southern Democrats, the law purposefully excluded certain occupational categories, like agriculture and domestic services. The majority of African Americans from benefiting from the law's protections. 254 Because of these exclusions, the FLSA essentially outlawed child labor in industrial settings, where most white children worked at the time, and allowed child labor in agricultural and domestic work. Black children worked. 255. Members of Congress were clear about the racist intent. For example, Florida Representative J. Mark Wilcox explicitly stated, "Cannot put the Negro and the white man on the same basis and get away with it. Not only would such a situation result in grave social and racial conflicts, but it would also result in throwing the Negro out of employment and in making him a public charge. There just is not any sense in intensifying this problem in the South, and this bill cannot help but produce such a result." 256. Congressman Cox of Georgia specifically objected to the possibility of equal wages because of the impact it would have on relieving the economic subjugation of African Americans central to the social organization of the South, stating the FLSA will, in destroying state sovereignty and local self-determination, the elimination and disappearance of racial and social distinctions. 257 As with other New Deal legislation, Congress included the agricultural and domestic service exemptions in order to secure the support from Southern Democrats needed to pass the legislation at all. 258. Other New Deal laws. The Fair Labor Standards Act excluded agriculture and domestic services from its labor protections. These exclusions, the FLSA essentially outlawed white child labor and continued to allow black child labor, because most white children worked in industrial settings and most black children in agricultural worked. Year-old boy receiving 20 cents for hamper of beans he picked for contract farmer, Homestead, Florida, 1939. Chapter 10. Labor and hindered opportunity. when the FLSA passed without applying to agricultural or domestic workers, or to employers engaged in intrastate commerce such as service workers, it achieved the explicit aims of the drafting Congress like the other New Deal legislation. Accomplished the withholding of protections from many African Americans through these race-neutral occupational exclusions. These carve-outs remained until the 1970s, and agricultural workers are still excluded from overtime protections. 259. Originally enacted, the FLSA did not address pay for tipped workers. 260. While tipping prior to the Civil War had been frowned upon by many as an aristocratic, European practice incompatible with American democracy. After the war, many restaurants and rail operators embraced tipping as a means of hiring newly freed African Americans without actually paying them. These workers were forced to labor for tips alone. 261. Tipping thus kept black workers in an economically and socially subordinate position. 262. The Supreme Court held that employers could count workers' tips toward their wages when calculating whether a worker was receiving minimum wage. 263. Employers did not need to pay their employees at all as long as workers' income from tips met or exceeded federal minimum wage. 264. Congress did not require a base wage for tipped employees until 1966. 265. Set then as 50% of the federal minimum wage. Tipped federal hourly minimum cash wage stands today at $2.13. Been for more than a quarter century. 266. The employer must make up the difference between this amount and the federal minimum hourly wage of $7.25 only if the employee's tips combined with the direct wages of at least $2.13 per hour do not equal the federal minimum hourly wage. 267. Today's tipped wage system carries the legacy of slavery. While black workers no longer are overrepresented in the tipped workforce, studies of the restaurant industry have revealed that diners consistently tip black servers less than white servers, regardless of service quality. 268 and 17. Of tipped working people of color live in poverty, compared to less than 13% of all tip workers. 269. Emergency Relief Administration 1933 to 1935 and Works Progress Administration 1935 to 1941. Federal Emergency Relief Administration (FERA) provided funding for state and local government programs in public works and the arts, and provided more than 20 million jobs. 270. But the program disproportionately spent its funds on unemployed white workers, refusing to hire black workers for anything except unskilled work, and paying less than the officially stipulated wage. 271. One local administrator stated that he had to tailor relief accommodate the demands of southern plantation owners for cheap farm labor by curtailing the level of relief payments to agricultural laborers and sharecroppers. 272. Works Progress Administration (WPA) replaced FERA in 1935, but continued its racist and often sexist practices. For example, driven by the presumption that men were the primary earners and most in need of jobs, amming needy families, most projects created heavy construction-type work for men, ignoring women's wage needs and limiting their opportunities. 273. From 1935 to 1941, fewer than 20% of all WPA workers were women and only about 3% were black women. 274. Projects to train women in domestic skills very often explicitly limited to only white women. 275. Government officials specifically workers out of WPA jobs when local conditions required cheap agricultural labor. In Oklahoma, a WPA official closed a black women's work project when there was a large cotton crop, writing to Washington, D.C., "These women are perfectly able to do this kind of work and there is plenty of work to do." 276. Civilian Conservation Corps 1933 to 1942. The Civilian Conservation Corps (CCC), a public works program focused on conservation projects. over 2.5 million men during its tenure, black and white women were completely excluded, just 10% of whom were black men 277. While this was somewhat similar to the percentage of African Americans in the population at large. Of the CCC replicated the racist government intervention seen in other programs, with explicitly limited participation numbers, official segregation at work camps, and with black workers restricted to the least desirable unskilled jobs. 278. For example, in Georgia, local selection agents refused to a single black applicant for almost a year, and only relented and enrolled a token number of African Americans after federal agents threatened to withhold the state's entire allotment of funds. 279. FARA provided funding for state and local government programs in public works and the arts, and provided more than 20 million jobs. 1935 to 1941, fewer than 20% of all workers were women and only about 3% were black women. Projects to train women in domestic skills were often explicitly limited to only white women. Tennessee Valley Authority. Tennessee Valley Authority was a public utility created by the federal government to bring jobs and development to an area hit especially hard in the Depression. The project included construction, conservation, and social service jobs. It remains one of the largest utilities in the country today. 280. It too continued the pattern of the other government works programs. Black workers were assigned to work separately on construction projects. Only allowed to work at all if there were enough black workers to make up a full segregated crew. 281. Black workers were also denied foreman or supervisory roles. 282. Agricultural Adjustment Administration. The federal government created the Agricultural Adjustment Administration (AAA) in 1933 to increase agricultural prices by paying farmers to grow fewer crops. 283. The administration of the AAA harmed black workers in three specific ways. The program reduced crop planting. For example, the agency limited the amount of land dedicated to cotton farming, but allowed each white landowner to decide which acres to stop cultivating, and most often they chose those worked by black tenant farmers and sharecroppers. 284. Landowners received federal payments, but the federal administration allowed white landowners to act as trustees for their black tenants without oversight from the AAA. 285. Often, landowners never paid their black tenants. 286. Third, the AAA allowed disputes over payments to be brought to local elected county committees and not black farmers served on a county committee throughout the South. 287. The county committees, composed of white landlords and white tenants, ruled against black tenants and directed the vast majority of benefits for the program to white farm owners. 288. In 1934. Reed of the National Urban League said that, so far as the Negroes in the South are concerned, the AAA and other New Deal agencies might just as well be administered by the Ku Klux Klan. 289.